All right, thank you everyone for joining us on our webinar about moving your career overseas. Before we formally begin, just a couple of quick introductions. My name is Richard Shontag. I'm a director at Taylor Root. I've been with the firm for about 8 years now. I work really closely with our consultants overseas in other jurisdictions, obviously, and help Australian lawyers move overseas. Before joining Taylor Root, I actually worked at Clayton Utz. If you're wondering about the accent, I was born in South Africa, lived there till I was about 15, moved to the UK for about like 3-4 years, and then came to Australia when I was about 19. So basically landed on Bondi Beach and decided I was never going back. So the accent is mixed, but yeah, very, very much Australian now. Joining me is also Michelle.
Hi, everyone. As Rich said, thank you all for joining us today for our webinar. It's exciting to see a lot of faces interested in making a move overseas. My name is Michelle Beckham. I work as a legal recruitment specialist for Taylor Root down in Melbourne. And you can probably tell from my accent, like Rich, I am not originally from Australia. I was born in Texas, spent a lot of time in Colorado. That's where I went to university. After I graduated, I moved across the world. So I've lived in Italy, Germany, and New Zealand, all before coming to Australia. I've been here for about 4 years now with no intention of leaving. So if anyone knows what it's like to move overseas, it's me. I'm sure Rich can attest to this, but I think the biggest scare about moving overseas is just usually that lack of certainty. Whether that's around jobs or timing of a move or just a new city, making friends, leaving friends, and moving away from that support and family, all of it can be extremely daunting. So we hope today to provide you with some assistance and some clarity around your overseas options. For many lawyers, the overseas dreams are high salaries, travel, and working and living in cities like London or New York and California. But these are not your only options, and we will cover all of these off today. So in summary, we'll go into detail regarding the London and US market, but we'll also touch base on the offshore market in the Middle East, Asia, and also the Caribbean. If you guys have any questions throughout the webinar, please put them down in the Q&A box and we will answer them toward the end.
Great, thanks. So I'm just going to share my screen so everyone has something to look at as we go through. Okay. So firstly, look, I'm sure everyone knows who Taylor Root are, but I really wanted to bring up the slide so everybody can have a really good idea about our global reach, which really provides some context around why we're doing this webinar. So we've got 13 offices across the globe. Office in US, UK, throughout Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, and obviously in Australia as well. We work obviously very closely with our consultants in these jurisdictions. We're quite big in terms of our global reach, but actually very small in each of the jurisdictions in which we sort of operate. And what that means is we can basically provide very bespoke and personal service to our clients. Most importantly, for candidates, it means that you can really broaden your horizons because we're the ones that are maintaining relationships with law firms in those jurisdictions and also building market intelligence. And really, this is where this webinar has come from, is since the start of this year, there's some of these jurisdictions with some of our clients who are really starting to tell us and really briefing us on roles, and they're starting to tell us that they will absolutely consider overseas qualified lawyers and Australians. So I guess the point of what we want to do here is let you know which areas are starting to come online, the types of firms that are looking, which practice groups, are sort of hot right now, salaries are in those jurisdictions, and I guess what the requirements are to be picked up for roles overseas as well. So we'll run through it by jurisdiction as we go. So the first jurisdiction we wanted to cover off is London. So by far and away, so far this year, this is the jurisdiction where we are being briefed on the most roles. I'm sure everyone experienced this last year, but recruitment in 2023, particularly towards the end, was really flat, particularly in London. And I think the reason for that was in 2021 and 2022 when law firms were experiencing incredibly high demand for their legal services. They really boosted their legal teams during that period to meet that demand. And then as we came through in 2023, that demand cooled slightly. I wouldn't say it was a dramatic fall off. It probably just normalized. But because they had the numbers, and then because I guess the impact of inflation and interest rates, started to be felt, recruitment just fell away. We've been really pleasantly surprised. So coming into this year, we're getting briefed on a lot of roles from London. Most importantly, they're telling us they'll consider Australians. So that's a real positive. In terms of the types of firms, it's absolutely, the big firms. So it's the US firms, Magic Circle firms, and probably the upper Silver Circle firms as well. That'll obviously increase as we go through this year. But so far, I would say those are the types of firms. In terms of which practice groups, so we've got a slide here which breaks it down into probably 3 different areas in terms of high, moderate, and low demand. In terms of high demand, banking and finance, in particular leverage finance, is the skill set that we're getting briefed on a lot at the moment. Private equity is definitely coming back really, really strongly, and then restructuring too. I would say restructuring is a little bit of a leftover from last year. There's still some firms looking, but I think our expectation is once those positions are filled, I think that's probably going to cool off for the rest of the year. In terms of moderate demand, we've got corporate and M&A on there. Definitely private M&A, I would say, is going to come back. Obviously, there's a lot of funds in the market waiting to be invested. And I would say that corporate and private M&A skill set is going to move on to high demand really quickly, like probably over the next few months. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on. Other areas of moderate demand, TMT, competition, projects, construction, and energy. Energy was originally, there was quite a few firms looking. I would say that sort of cooled slightly. There's absolutely firms looking in these areas, but probably not quite as hot as the areas in high demand. And then in terms of low demand, at the moment, I would say litigation, real estate, employment, and IP. Traditionally, we really struggle with helping Australian litigators pick up roles overseas. In our experience, this is mainly just due to the fact that I think a lot of firms over there tend to get a lot of applications from the local market and just look to UK qualified lawyers to sort of fill that need. Moving on to requirements, we really wanted to cover this off because I guess at the moment we're noticing that the expectations of our clients in London is just sky high. So in our experience, whenever we worked with an Australian and they pick up a role in London and sometimes get multiple offers, they generally have 3 things. It's 4 years worth of relevant experience. You must be coming from a reputable firm in Australia. And by that, I mean a top tier firm or an international firm, ideally with minimal moves on your CV. Obviously, if you have one, it's not an absolute deal breaker, but I think if you have minimal moves, it definitely sets you apart. And then the other thing is good academics. And I think by that, I mean, they're just solid. So high credit and above, obviously, if you're into distinction, that's great. But just as long as they're solid, I think that sort of holds its weight. It's not absolutely impossible, right? I just wanted to say this. If you don't have these 3 things, the only thing is that it just becomes a little bit harder if, like, let's say maybe you're 3 PQE, or if you're coming from a firm maybe outside of the top tiers or a big international. It's not impossible. It's just a little bit harder. And the reason for that is that you always need to consider who your competition might be for those roles. So they might be getting really good UK qualified lawyers apply, to really sort out the market. They've probably got lawyers from, other jurisdictions applying. Maybe there's Australians applying with these criteria as well. So, it's not impossible. It's just a little bit more difficult because you might be coming up against people who have really good profiles. I'll give you a really good example of something that we experienced at the beginning of this year. So we were working with a US firm. I think this was at the beginning of February. They briefed us on a role. They received something like 50 CVs within the first 24 hours, from a range of different places. I think they had received 80 CVs in total, all of which were very relevant for the skill set, and they obviously picked five to interview and obviously, offered someone from that. Don't be disheartened by the numbers. I think the key takeaway from that we find is that it's really speed to market. So if your CV is one of the first ones to apply, it definitely sits on top of the pile. And as long as you are close to these, three requirements, it definitely will be considered. Moving on to salaries. I'll leave the slide up for everyone to have a look through, and obviously you can pick, the salary based on the firm and then your sort of level. The key thing to mention here is obviously, US law firms, it's phenomenal money. They pay far and away, better than anybody else in the market. The key thing is they absolutely take their pound of flesh from you too. We're talking, between 2,000 and 3,000 billables, a year. It's weekend work, so it's quite full on, but you get the financial rewards, absolutely. Then below that, you've got the Magic Circle firms. I would say the intensity of work is fairly close to the US firms, actually. Maybe not quite as intense, but it's pretty close. The pay is not as strong, but to be honest, it's still really good when you're coming from Australia. And then obviously you've got the Silver Circle firms on there as well. The other key takeaway is look, if you secure a role in the UK with any of these types of firms, you're going to get an uplift on salary, regardless of where you go. And obviously, as you move up, in terms of, high demand for their roles, there's a lot of people that want to work at the US firms and Magic Circle firms. There's just more people applying. But definitely, I think the salaries as you move up, like you can see in the US firms, is great. These are all in Australian dollars, by the way. Then the next slide we wanted to run through is just visas and qualifications and how that works, just in the event that people aren't unaware. So obviously, the best course open to people is if you have a British passport or a Tier 1 ancestry visa. That's great because it means that, a law firm doesn't need to spend money to sponsor you. So it does set you apart a little bit, but not everybody has that. The law firms are very happy to sponsor people. They do it all the time. So if they do pick up sponsorship, generally that's on the Tier 2 working visa. That's valid for 2 years. And at the end of the 2 years, you can actually renew it for another 2 years. The other option available to people is the Tier 5 Youth Mobility Visa. It's something you can apply for yourself. It gives you full working rights. It's eligible for anybody, which has now changed. I think it's under the age of 35. It was originally 30, I think. So yes, under the age of 35, anybody can get it. You have full working rights. And generally what would happen is if a firm sees you have that, when they bring you in, they would move you onto the Tier 2 working visa. And then in terms of requalification, it's exactly the same as if UK qualified lawyers move here. You don't need to requalify straight away to practice. The firm will bring you in as an overseas qualified consultant. You can practice. If you're staying long term, obviously it's very beneficial to requalify. That could take, I think what would happen is you would work with the law society over there, and then the law firm would support you on that. The law firm, the law society would determine, I guess, what you need to do in terms of subjects and length of time to do the requalification. But you absolutely don't need to do it straight away. That was the UK, so I'll hand over to Michelle for the US.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rich. I will move on to the US legal market. So chances are, you guys, if you're looking at heading overseas and you don't have your sights set on the UK, it's likely you're looking into your US options, and for good reason. The US has some of the biggest and most prestigious international firms in the world and is also one of the highest paying markets. That being said, just like Australia and the UK, we have definitely seen a shift in the market since the heights of 2021 and 2022. As Rich talked about, the US has started to feel the effects of inflation and interest rates, and in return, recruitment there also fell a bit by the wayside. While the UK has started to see a shift and a pickup, which is very exciting, we're still seeing a little bit of a lull in the need for foreign lawyers in the United States. Although we are hopeful that another shift is on the horizon and we will start to see more of a pickup as the year goes on. Um, And just some of the great firms coming out of the US, we've got Kravitz, Swain and Moore, Skadden, Kirkland and Ellis, Latham and Watkins, just a whole range of really amazing firms. In terms of practice areas, look, most of the roles can be found within transactional practices. So anywhere in that banking and finance, private equity, corporate M&A. We're also seeing a big increase in the needs for energy and resources. TMT and IP will be really strongly in demand for California, specifically in places like Silicon Valley. We see a moderate demand within sectors like competition and construction. And while real estate was extremely in demand a few years ago, we've seen the market kind of stabilize and resulting in less of a need now. On the lower end of that demand, we'll see practices such as litigation and employment, again, at least for US or yeah, at least for overseas lawyers going to the US. In lines with the UK, it typically is seen that lawyers who practice, commercial litigation or who are across contentious matters generally find it more difficult to find work in the US. Like Rich previously states, this is due to competition with domestic lawyers and the lack of international arbitration experience. So typically the US leans toward their domestic candidates for these. All right. And as far as requirements goes, so you really would like to have anywhere from that 2 to 8 years of relevant experience before trying to move over to the US. Um, Most of the experience should, again, be from a top tier or large international firm, solid academics, and of course, you must be admitted to the Bar Association of the state which you wish to practice. Um, Look, it depends on the firm, but typically when coming over to the US, you'll be discounted anywhere from 1 to 2 PQE depending on the firm. Typically, around 7 to 8 year PQE is where things start to get a little bit tricky, right? That would put you at roughly a 6 PQE in the States. And usually at this level, you're being required to supervise and lead a team, which can be very challenging if you have not set the bar or you do not have the knowledge of the jurisdiction. So usually that sweet spot for making a move over is within, 3 to 5 years PQE. Like in the UK, previous experience and strong academic background remains incredibly important. However, unlike the UK, like I mentioned, you will need to be admitted to the Bar Association. I'll go a bit more in depth about the bar in a few slides. With all of that in mind, historically, New York tends to be the most popular US destination for lawyers because of the invaluable experience gained within major complex transactions and blue chip clients. It's just a huge career accelerator for most Australians, and it really sets you up very well for your future against other candidates in the competitions when you return back home to Aussie. Uh, Look, the well structured firms and bustling business of New York may be enticing for a lot of people, but we have seen in the last few years quite a pickup in the West Coast, particularly California, in cities like Los Angeles, San Diego, Palo Alto, and of course, Silicon Valley. Um, where New York tends to run more on, I would say, perfectionism, California law is probably better described as more pragmatic and cost efficient advice. These companies overall tend to run a little bit leaner than New York companies do, which means on the positive, you get more responsibility, you're upskilling, and the opportunity to broaden your practice is there. Now, that's not to say that California doesn't offer opportunities to specialize, but it seems to just be more acceptable to diversify, which is great. However, on the other hand, because these companies do run a bit leaner, the opportunities there might not be as prevalent as you would find in, say, New York. And just a big reminder, y'all, if you're not feeling intrigued by, the busyness of New York or that laid back lifestyle of California, you have other options in the States. Coming from Texas, Houston is a great option, especially if you are in the sector of, energy and resources. So if you think that a move is on the horizon, do not limit your options. Look into other states. And now we will move on to a big factor for many of you, I'm sure, the money. As in the slides for the UK, we've broken it down to PQEs, and we've also put it in Aussie dollars for you guys. As you can see, US salaries are pretty much unmatched. I mean, where else can you get 350 AUD as a one PQE? So it is exciting. But it's just important to remember that these roles come with a lofty expectations, should I say. It's not unusual for lawyers in top firms to have a target of around, on average, I would say 2,100 billable hours, and some obviously more than that. In comparison here, I know it's usually around, 1,650 or 1,800. So US firms are not for everyone for that reason. However, we've placed a lot of candidates over in the US, and we have gotten a lot of feedback that say, the expectations don't lie far off from the top tier firms here in Australia when they're at their busy periods. In addition to high salaries, US firms do tend to offer excellent relocation packages, which is great. So they usually cover expenses like flights, the shipment of all your belongings. Usually, however, accommodation is not part of the deal. And then we will jump into the visas. Fortunately for Australians, you are able to get the E3 visa, which is made exclusively for Australians working for US employers in a professional capacity. So hopefully you all can read the requirements off to the side of the screen, but I'll just go through them with you. You must be an Australian citizen and hold an Australian passport. You must have a job offer from a US employer. The next two, you obviously don't have to worry about, as everyone on here, I'm assuming, is a lawyer. You've all had your degrees, but essentially you must have a 4-year bachelor's degree, and the proposed role in the United States must be one that would typically require a bachelor's degree or equivalency. Then you go down to the sponsoring US employer must be willing to pay you the required prevailing wage and obtain a certified labor condition application from the US Department of Labor. You must apply for the E3 visa through an in-person visa interview at a state consulate. So this visa lasts roughly for 2 years. However, you can extend those 2 years indefinitely, which is great. And to make it easier, because I know it sounds all a bit daunting, US law firms do generally work with their own immigration services and are able to take care of your visa requirements. So it does make the process a lot easier, which is really nice. And now we move on to the bar, which I know can be very scary for some of you. But like I mentioned, you do need to be admitted to the Bar Association of the state you are wanting to practice in. So each state establishes its own rules for admission, and some states have made it a little bit easier for foreign qualified lawyers than other states. So places like New York and California. Generally, the bar is held in February and July. The good news is, though, in most cases, you are able to start with a firm before taking the bar exam, which is great. US firms tend to cover the cost of the exam for you. A lot of them pay for standard bar training courses, and some provide up to 4 weeks paid study leave. That being said, it is so important to remember that the first 6 to 12 months can be really difficult for a foreign lawyer. So in addition to all those uncertainties that we've talked about in relocating, you're also juggling a new firm, new jurisdictions, new transactions, and then you'll be coming home to study for the bar. So in that aspect, it can be really overwhelming, and it's just important to maintain those realistic expectations while you're settling into a new role. Now, that being said, for those of you who are really dedicated to making a move without a role, sitting the bar exam before landing a position is definitely doable. Um, Overall, your experience, your practice area, deal sheets, rankings of your previous firms, stability of employment history, all of these things are incredibly important to US employers, right? So should you be slightly wavering in one of those areas, passing the bar can really make you more marketable to US firms, and that can elevate your chances if you're finding that you're struggling. Um, Also, just to note, the States is incredibly expensive. So if you do choose to take that route, please make sure you're well prepared. And I think that
Now,
pretty much sums up. Yeah, Rich.
yeah, we'll just move on to a couple other areas now, which we wanted to go through. I would say these areas are not quite as buoyant as the UK and the US, at the moment. They will change as we go through this year. And we have seen Australian lawyers move to these jurisdictions in the past, and there's a lot of benefits for moving to some of these places. So we thought we'd just go through them relatively quickly. We'll show you some salary information so people have some ideas of what's on offer, and talk about the practice groups too. So um, the first area is what's commonly known as offshore. It's a bit of a lesser known quantity for Australian lawyers. We've absolutely helped people move to some of these jurisdictions in the past, and they love it. And the reason for that is that generally there's a bit more sun and surf. But areas include, Cayman Islands, British Virgin Islands, Bermuda, and then the Channel Islands between England and France. Um, General practice areas include, corporate banking, insolvency, funds is quite big in offshore, and litigation as well. And actually, this is one area where we do see Australian litigators, pick up roles. It's obviously tax-free as well, so the financial rewards are pretty good. Then moving on to the next one, which is the Middle East. So most expats tend to look at Dubai and Abu Dhabi. Again, salaries are great, really competitive. It's tax-free, so the rewards are great as well. Um, Generally, the practice areas over there tend to focus around corporate and banking. There's a lot of construction and infrastructure work which goes on over there as well. So, lots of those lawyers tend to pick up roles. Yeah, but I would say at the moment these two areas are fairly cool in terms of the volume of roles, but we absolutely expect them to pick up as we go through this year.
Fantastic. And now we will move on to some places a little bit closer to home. So the next couple of slides, we will show you salaries for Hong Kong and Singapore. So whether you have Mandarin language skills or not, I would recommend both Hong Kong and Singapore. However, in regards to someplace like mainland China, you really do need that language skills to get a position. Both destinations are great to work in. They're both low tax environments, and you get an excellent amount of work. So if you have, corporate M&A, banking and finance, capital markets, experience in employment, then both options are definitely available for you. If you have any M&A, mining, energy and projects, more that focus, I would highly recommend Singapore. So Singapore really is a compelling option. You work on really high profile global deals on both the lender and sponsor side. It's also nice that it's close to Australia, so you can enjoy some trips home and obviously maybe make your way to Bali or Thailand, or Europe is just one flight away as well. Look, we are seeing a little bit of a pickup in Singapore and Hong Kong. So if you guys are interested in either of these locations, now is a great time to reach out and have a conversation. But I think that pretty much wraps us up as far as locations and everything we wanted to go through. So I think we'll jump into the Q&A portion. Rich and I are very happy to go over anything with you guys, any questions that you might have. So if if you have any questions, please go ahead and drop them into the Q&A box and we'll get to those now. Maybe.
Right. Well, I guess if no one has any questions, we will wrap things up. So thank you very much for
Oh,
joining.
Rich,
What was-
sorry, we do have one question here.
one's just
Apologies.
come through.
Yes, like it just came
Great.
through. Yes, so it says, how long does the process from initial application to offer typically take for UK firms? Rich, I'll let you answer this since you covered the UK.
Sure. Thank you. So I would say, in terms of from application to be made an offer, I would say at least allow for a month and a half to 2 months. Things can just take a little bit longer in the UK market, purely because of the volume. But I would say if your CV gets picked up, generally there's, maybe 3 rounds of interviews that they would go through. And what we normally would see is, that can go through in about a month and a half to 2 months. Sometimes the application process, purely while you're waiting for, your CV to be picked up, that can actually take a while, just purely because of the volume. So that does tend to stretch it out. But I would say if you have 2 months in your mind, that's probably a good number to aim for.
Fantastic. So the next question that we have is, in general, there are no countries that are looking to hire employment lawyers. Is that right?
Do you want to
Look,
take a stab at that?
yeah, absolutely. Look, so just because it is lower in demand doesn't mean that the roles aren't out there. Really, it just means there's a bit of a scarcity. It might take longer to find the role, but that does not mean that the roles aren't there. I think probably, and Rich, correct me if I'm wrong, coming from Australia, I think the UK would be a much better fit than the US just because it's governed very, very differently. And for that reason, I might push the efforts toward the UK, but again, it will be a longer process.
Yeah, and I'd say employment is one of those areas where firms tend to look to local candidates, to fill roles. Um, as always, it's supply and demand, So I think if there's more roles, maybe less people looking, then expectations might change. At the moment, I would say it's fairly low though, but that might change in the future, and it's something to keep an eye on.
Fantastic. So we've got, is the market good in Europe at the moment? Netherlands, Germany. Again, Rich, you can give your insight, but I know that it is a little bit trickier to make the moves over to places like the Netherlands and Germany just because of the visa. And, obviously over here we deal a lot with common law, same with the UK, and in different countries, obviously that's not the case.
Yeah, and also just the legal market's not quite as big. So we're still waiting to see some more volume of roles come through in those areas. So, they're great places to work, and absolutely people have moved there in the past. But right now, I don't think we're seeing the volume of roles come through. And in particular, like again, like what Michelle said with employment, there probably is roles, but just not enough where they are starting to consider overseas qualified lawyers. So they're probably just looking to the local market for now. But yeah, it's a little bit different to the UK. The UK is where we're seeing the volume at the moment.
So we've got, what about intern contract work as a way to get a foot in the door? Rich, do you want to answer this one?
Yes, and look, it is a really good way to get your foot in the door. It tends to depend on the market, having, I guess, a volume of roles where they need to offer people contract positions. I would tread with caution. I think it's always better to, pick up a, more permanent role with a good law firm before you move over. The last thing you need is to pick up, some type of contract work. It might not necessarily be in your area of specialty, and it can be a little bit of a black hole on your CV. So it definitely can help, but I would just tread with caution.
So we've got, does Taylor Root help us to customize our, I'm assuming this meant CV for specific
CV.
markets. Yeah. Thanks for the presentation, especially on other jurisdictions in Asia. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
And absolutely, we definitely do help with the CVs, especially because we work with our other offices very closely. We're always on the ball in terms of what's going on in the market. So there may be aspects of your CV that we ask you to highlight, or specific matters that we ask you to go into more detail, things like that. That way, it just kind of sets you apart. But we absolutely do help with the CV process.
Yeah, I think it's one thing that we do really well, and it's part of our really personal, service to people, particularly when they're moving overseas, is, we know what our clients are looking for. We know the role. We know which part of your skill set really matches that. And we work with you, every step of the way to make sure that, your CV is in the best possible shape. So your applications, really well received, and it can really set you apart. So yeah, absolutely. We support people every step of the way through that.
Amazing. So if I'm looking to move to London at the end of this year, when should I start putting out CVs, etc.? It's a hard
Would say if
question to
you,
answer.
yeah,
Yeah. Go ahead,
go
Rich.
on, you go first.
No, I was just going to say it's a hard question to answer.
Mm.
Obviously, the market may shift as well, but timing can take a while, right? So like Rich said, with his, U.S. law firm in the UK, he gave that example of how 50 applications came in the first hour, 80 total, and 5 of those got chosen. So for that reason, it could take a good amount of time, and I would personally start really keeping an eye on the market and getting your CV out there. Because again, once you hit that interview stage, that could take a couple of months as well.
Yeah, and start letting us know, now about it, because we can start having conversations and keep you in mind for when roles come up. And I think if you think of, your notice period, how long it could take to, be offered a role from application to offer, a bit of extra time to move over, all of that just takes, can just take time. So what I think is start the process now. We're almost into March. It's amazing how quickly timing goes. Work really closely with us, and we can keep a really close eye on what's happening overseas in the area where you want to go to. Sorry, in this case, it's London. Um, and I think you could almost start the process now because things do take time.
Yeah, absolutely. We definitely pride ourselves on keeping you updated all the way. So the sooner you let us know, the better. I'm working with candidates right now who are not looking to leave until, even maybe next year, but are a little bit flexible. And just keeping everyone up to date in terms of what's going on in the market is really important. Roles that might come up that they may be interested in, and also keeping an update on the timing and how quickly things are moving and progressing over there, although everything can change and shift. So the next question is, can you speak to the market in Dublin? Is it comparable to the London market at all?
Great consideration. We have an office in Dublin, and we've helped a few people move actually over there. It's very comparable. I'd say maybe the salaries are not quite as strong as London, particularly within the US firms and Magic Circle firms. But they are very good, and I think you'll absolutely see, a really good uptick in your salary. But it's definitely a really good consideration.
And if you are looking at moving to Dublin, like Rich said, we do have an office there. So always happy to, stay in touch and put you in touch as well with the recruitment consultants that are on that end too. How competitive is it to land a NQ role in London? Is there a particular time of year that they are more in demand? So, start or end of the year?
Mm. Yeah, I would say it's really difficult to pick up an NQ role, and I think just going back to our requirements, I think generally when firms are looking for lawyers from overseas, they need to have those three things, so 4 years, 4 years worth of experience, coming from a strong firm, decent academics. I think as long as you have that, it helps. NQs, it can be really difficult to pick up roles over there purely because you're competing with a lot of people from that jurisdiction.
And then it looks like our last question is, can a paralegal role help land a lawyer role eventually?
It's another thing that I would tread with some
Tread
caution.
lightly, yeah.
Yes, I've seen some people who have tried to do that in the past and they end up doing paralegal work for 3 years and then coming home. And it's a bit of a gap on your CV and with your experience. So I haven't necessarily seen it help significantly. Like it might be able to. I think you'd have to be quite lucky, but it's not something that I would recommend doing.
Agreed. All right, guys. I think that wraps up our Q&A portion of today's webinar.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. We'll obviously be in touch, with everybody who participated after this, just to connect, see how you're going. We'd love to hear from you with what your plans are, and obviously, work with you guys if you are considering a move. So yes, we'll be in touch after the webinar. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, guys.